We've mentioned in the past that Kabbalas HaTorah and Har Sinai is understood as a chuppah, as a marriage between Klal Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in the light of that comparison, we could derive a number of conclusions. In the Sephardic world, the final word of like what we would call the Mishnah Berurah is called the Kaf HaChaim. And the Kaf HaChaim writes that Chag HaShavuos, as a mirror image of marriage, requires that the Shabbos before Shavuos be considered Shabbos Kala. There's a marriage about to take place, and we know that the Shabbos before the marriage is called the Shabbat Kala, and he holds that the Shabbat before Shavuos is to be called Shabbat Kala. Not only that, he says that on that Shabbos before Shavuos, we should be learning the laws that are relevant to Shavuos. And he has a psak, which is quite new from Rabbi Yisrael Najara, in which he says that there's a liturgical poem which is called Tanoim, all about Maimed Har Sinai. And there's another liturgical poem which is called Ketubah, the Ksuba. And he says on that Shabbos before Shavuos, we should be reading those piyutim, those liturgical poems, because we're entering into Tanoim and Ksuba. That's the nature of the Shabbos before Chag HaShavuos. And he goes on to tell us that for the week before Shavuos, for the week after Shavuos, from the 7th of Sivan all the way to the 13th of Sivan, we should not be reciting Tachnun. We understand that because it's Tashlumin, meaning when the Beis HaMikdash stood, we could bring the Karbanos if we missed it on Shavuos. But he interprets it as Shivas Yemei HaMishteh, and a Chosan, wherever he davens for the 7 days after his wedding, we don't say Tachnun. And that halacha of Shivas Yemei HaMishteh should apply for all of Klal Yisrael. We're all in this marriage relationship after Shavuos. So from Shavuos and on for a week, no Tachnun. I don't think anyone here would object to that, although some of the Litvaks maybe would, but the Hasidim, they're okay, if you need an excuse. But we don't say Tachnun for another reason. Then he says the following. The Gemara in Masechta Kiddushin and in Masechta Tainis says Yom Chasunasa, which is a pasuk in Shir HaShirim, Zeh Yom Matan Torah, clearly indicating an analogy between the day of Matan Torah and Chag HaShavuos and the day of a Chasana, because Matan Torah represents the Chasana. And he has a minhag here that anyone who dedicates a Sefer Torah, that itself is like a marriage. He writes, Yesh noagim shebiyom machnisim Sefer Torah chadash lebeis hakneses lo lomar tachnun, just like a chosan doesn't say tachnun. And when he shows up in shul on the day of his wedding, no one says tachnun. So too, when someone donates a Sefer Torah to a shul, that's like a chasana. And that's why we make such a beautiful celebration. And therefore, we should not say Tachnun on the day that we bring a Sefer Torah into a shul. It's like a day of a chasan. But that's not enough. Now we're ready for the clincher. And this is in a Sefer, which is called Ir Binyamin, by Rabbi Binyamin Zev Wolf. He writes that if on the day that they bring the Sefer Torah into the shul, they read the Sefer Torah for the first time, he says if you find a psul in the Sefer Torah, then completely ignore it. Because the halacha is that a chasan who has a nega, which is loosely translated into English as a lesion, is nosnim lo kol shiva simei mishteh, and the Kohen will not investigate the nega until after the 7 days of mishteh, which is an amazing halacha, but that's a doraisa halacha. And we're going to apply that halacha to a Sefer Torah that's being brought to the shul for the first time, that when we read it, we shouldn't look for the nega. And even if you find some sort of mistake in the Sefer Torah, shush up about it. Now, the truth is that the equation to a chasan is not really a valid equation, because in the case of a chasan, until the Kohen declares the nega tameh, it's not tameh. So that we're just saying that by postponing the Rias HaKohen until after the Shiva Simei Mishteh, we are postponing the status of the Chasan as a Mitzorah. But in the case of a Psul in the Sefer Torah, you already found the Psul in the Sefer Torah. So there's no question about it that the Sefer is possible. It's not like the case of a Nega, whereby postponing the Rias HaKohen, you're suspending the neg. But in any event, we now talk about a Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi quotes Rav Mesharshia, who points out that in every single korban, the Torah uses the word chet. And there's a long list of parshios in the Torah, including the Moadim, where the Torah talks about bringing a sa'ir lechatos for chet. The only exception is Shvuos, Chag Atzeres. The word chet is completely and in a very profound way omitted from the Karbanos, and it says, Seir izim echad lechaper alechem. No word chet appears. And the Medrash points out, Amar lehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, mikevan shekibaltem alechem ol Torah, mala ani alechem ki'ilu lo chatasem miyamechem. There's no need for a karban chatos, because on the day that we accept the Torah, Hashem says, I'm going to consider it as if you never sinned. And the language of the Medrash sounds like from now on, we are not sinners because we accepted the Torah. And if you look in the super commentary on Yerushalmi, the Korban HaEdah, he writes that B'chol Shana Batzeres, year in and year out, annually, in Atzeres on Shvuos, Hu Yom Asher Amadnu Lifnei Har Sinai, U'Mekablim Es HaTorah Michadash. Every year we receive the Torah anew, and therefore there's no chatos. We can't apply chet because it's already a day in which we makabel the Torah, and there's no chet on the day in which we makabel the Torah. Al kein tzrichem Yisrael l'smoach shem mochel HaKadosh Baruch Hu avonoseihem liYisrael. There's a great day of simcha. You know, we talk about why there's a great simcha on Pesach, why there's a great simcha on Sukkot, Sabachta b'chagecha, and now we're adding a great element of simcha on Chag HaShvuos, because that's the day in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because of our Kabbalas HaTorah, and this is annually, he is mochel our chatoim. What greater simcha could there be? Now, I think in the past we've mentioned the great Rabbi Rav Shlomo HaKohen from Vilna, and he's very upset about this Yerushalmi. How can you take this Yerushalmi literally, as if to say that once we makabel the Torah, then God considers this as if we never sinned? I mean, you can't even entertain such an idea. We have a principle of our faith that God will punish sin, and we need a kapara. You can't say, no, we don't need a kapara because we accepted the Torah. He says the following. What does the Yerushalmi have in mind? That on every Chag HaShvuos, when we accept the Torah anew, It's considered as if on this day we accepted the Torah. And that shows how beloved it is for us to renew our commitment to Torah. And in the light of that Kabbalah, out of a sense of love that we, we have a chavivus and we accept the Targum Mitzvahs again, we become what's called gerim. Accepting the Targum Mitzvahs is something obviously typical of a convert, of a ger. And the halacha is that ger sheniskayer kikotin shenol adam. So the ger is no longer held accountable for all the sins he may or may not have committed during the course of his gayus. Now he's a kotin shenol adam. This is the day of his birthday. And the Yushalmi is telling us that if we accept the Torah on Shavuos, then we accepting Targum Mitzvahs, we become like a ger. Just like our forefathers at the time Matan Torah became gerim, we now on an annual basis become gerim. And therefore, we're not held responsible for those averos because we're a ger katan. Again, what will be from now on, that's a different story. However, in the light of everything we've been saying, that Matan Torah is analogous to a chuppah and to a marriage between the chassan and the kala being Knesset Yisrael, the chassan being the Ribono Shel Olam, then we have halacha that on the day of the chasana, both the chassan and the kala, mochlim lehem al kol avonoseihem. So we are now a chassan kala when we accept the Torah, and therefore mochlim lahem al kol avonoseihem. And this is all based on the Gemara in Tainis that B'yom Chasminoso is Matan Torah. I want to share with you a beautiful insight, and you're all familiar with it, but it always pays to go over it, of the Beis HaLevi, Rabbi Yoshe Ber Brisker. The Gemara tells us in Masechta Shabbos Peiches that when we accepted Naasav and Nishma, the Malachi Hashois came down and crowned each Jew with 2 crowns. And mi gila lahem leponai roz zeh shemalachi Hashois b'sharshin. The Gemara says, B'shosh ekdimu nasa l'nishma. Why is it so significant that Nasa came before Nishma? And the Beis HaLevi gives us a whole new interpretation. He says that if we would have said Nishma and then Nasa, it would imply that the purpose of Nishma, of Torah, is Nasa, is to implement the mitzvahs. And for sure that's true because Ein Amoritz Chassid. But it would mean that Talmud Torah, as a mitzvah, as an entity, would exhaust itself in preparing ourselves for Nasa. So we have Nishma and then Nasa. No. We're going to say and declare Nasa first and then Nishma. What that means is that we've already done the mitzvahs, meaning Nasa means that we learned all the requirements and technicalities of how to implement a mitzvah. But now we have Nishma. Now our study of Torah is not for the sake of Nasa, but it's an independent end unto itself. Not a means to an end, but an end to itself. And this is the concept of Torah Lishma. Many schools of thought would have it that Torah has to be Lamaisa. If you don't learn the Torah with Halacha Lamaisa, it's hardly worth much. But in the Beis HaLevi's perspective, it's just the opposite. When you learn Torah for the sake of Halacha, that's called Nishma and then Nasa. But the greater level is Nasa first we've covered the mitzvahs, we know how to implement them, and then it's nishma, and then we dedicate ourselves to the study of Torah. And whenever I think of this Beis HaLevi, I think of the idea of Amkus b'Torah, just getting deeper and deeper into the Torah. I also think of the famous Chazal regarding Beis Hillel, Beit Shammai, that Elu v'Elu divrei Elokim chaim. So if you had a choice between learning Beit Shammai or learning Beis Hillel, would you choose Beis Hillel because we paskin like Beis Hillel? Is the Torah study of Beit Shammai, does that fall short of the Torah study of Beis Hillel? If I learn a sugya ben sorer or moreh, where Chazal say lo hoyev lo nivra, do I get less schar for throwing myself into that sugya in Masechtas Sanhedrin than into the sugya of Keitzam Avarchim al Peros? Are we meant to advocate? You know, our little Zoom shir, I always say, is like an extension of the yeshiva. We have our own little yeshiva here. It has certain logistical challenges. Like I can barely see you on the screen now because I have a problem with my laptop. But it's nice psychedelic colors. But this is a yeshiva. And you might say, well, what's the curriculum for yeshiva? And without downgrading in any way the study of Halacha, but is that going to be the curriculum of a yeshiva? From dawn till dusk, that's all we'll do is learn Halacha? If you're a Sfaradi, then you want to learn the tshuvas of Rav Ovadia Yosef and spend your time just on those tshuvas or Mishnah Brura. But the answer is no. We need a proper balance. The Gemara says in Masechta Megillah, Mevatlin Talmud Torah leMikra Megillah. What is that all about? My Rebbe used to say, the Gemara makes no sense. I mean, Mikra Megillah is also part of the Torah. It's one of the Chaf Daled Sifrei HaKodesh. So why is that called Bittul Torah? And I remember he used to say that if you could be misamek in Torah, you could delve deeply into Torah. And instead you just read psukim, person is going to dedicate himself to read Tehillim the whole day. Very nice. And it certainly is a kiyum of Talmud Torah because Tehillim is part of Torah Shabbat. But if he totally ignores the learning of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Nishma as an end unto itself, because you've already finished with the Nasa, then he's giving up on a major critical chunk of Torah study. So as great as it is to learn what we call Sugya Aliba de Shmaita, Shmaita Aliba de Hilchasa, that's for sure. And that's a special Mila. But there's also another dimension to Talmud Torah. And that's Torah for the sake of Torah. And up in Shamayim, the Malachim, when they learn Torah, they don't have to learn Torah in order to implement the mitzvahs. They don't have the mitzvahs. But that Talmud Torah, the Mesifta Durakia, is a Talmud Torah of Nishma. It's an end unto itself. When I learn the Torah, I understand the Chachma of Hashem. The Baal HaTanya is famous for saying, I become one with the Seichel, with the Chachma of Hashem. And if I understand the Migu, that Ruvain claimed so-and-so, but he could have claimed a different claim. And we believe on his first claim because he could have given a better claim. All that is Iyun B'Torah. And his Samchus B'Torah is what it's all about. And to be Machadish Chidushim, new insights. So that's the Beis HaLevi about Nasiv and Isma.
So that would be an argument against what Moshe tried to, when Hashem said to Moshe, the Rav talked about this, I think it was 2 weeks ago, that Moshe had said to them, do you have lulav, do you have... This would go against that.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that what Moshe Rabbeinu has is two dimensions to the Torah. One dimension is the lulav and the esrog, the kiyum mitzvahs, overcoming the Yetzer Hara.
Right, but the deeper part, you're saying, is not to do it. And Moshe brought that.
It's an unto itself. There's no difference in learning about Ben Sorer Morer than learning about Hilchas Kriyat Shema. It's all on the same level.
Right, but Moshe's argument, right? The Rav talked about Moshe's argument that Hashem said to Moshe, to the Malachim, was, do you have the mitzvahs to do? Well, the Malachim could have answered back, exactly. We don't have the mitzvahs to do, so our kiyum of the Torah is on a much higher level than you, Bnei Yisrael, down below, who are doing it possibly just to learn to do Mikhayev the mitzvahs.
So that's what I'm saying, Joe. We're talking about two different dimensions of Torah. There's one dimension of Torah that puts man in a superior position to the Malachim. And that's because we have to face all the challenges of the Yetzer Hara, et cetera, and we need the Torah to overcome them, and so forth and so on. But I'm just pointing out that there's another dimension to Talmud Torah. And again, I don't know if the Malachim are capable of being Mechadish Chidushim in Torah because they don't have the Bailas over Torah. They don't have the ability to connect the Torah to this physical world. But nevertheless, we have an ability to study the Torah in its greatest depth. And whether or not that leads to a final halachic conclusion, you know that in many yeshivas, they studied Kodshim. And now it's becoming even more popular. Kodshim is hardly halacha l'maisa. Even Zroim is very far from halacha l'maisa to a large extent. Now we have Eretz Yisrael, Medinas Yisrael, it's a little different. And then you talk about taros. Imagine studying taros day and night. And it's, again, there's one part of taros in the laws of Nida, but other than that, say half of the Torah almost is not relevant to halacha. Does that mean I'm going to cut it off? In Valozhin Yeshiva, they learned the Torah from brachos to uktzin without skipping anything. Every Masechta was studied with the great depth in the mother of all yeshivas in Valozhin. And that, I believe, reflects this philosophy of Naseh, and then there's Nishma. And the Nishma stands on its own 2 feet.
But I would just comment, the yeshiva world has forgotten the Nasa.
What do you mean?
There's no halacha in yeshiva. We don't learn halacha at all. In yeshiva, your yeshiva curriculum, you learn halacha for 15 minutes a day in the morning, and that's it.
I don't think that's accurate, Bobby. Maybe that was true years ago, but today, every yeshiva has an important halacha seder. And Mishnah Berurah is a basic part of the curriculum. In the Sephardic yeshivas, even more so.
Maybe in the Sephardic yeshivas, but in the Litvish yeshivas, unless it totally changed, you had a halacha seder after Shachris for a half an hour or whatever, and the rest of the day was spent on learning Gemara, Be'iyun in the morning, Be'kiyas at night, Chazor, in the afternoon. There's the yeshiva system, because
you're saying we're lacking a balance, you're saying?
Yes.
Maybe you're right. I don't know. Maybe you're right. I know, for example, in more Hasidic yeshivas, they put a tremendous emphasis on learning Halacha. I wanted to study with you a maimar in the Gemara in Chulin. The Gemara says the following. Omar Rabbi Chama bar Rav Chanina. My dichsiv, pasuk in Shir Hashirim, kitapuach batzei haya. Klal Yisrael are compared to a tapuach. Lomar lecha ma tapuach pirio kodem li olav af Yisrael hikdimu nasa l'nishma. Frek Rabbeinu Tam, I don't get it. I looked at a tapuach tree, and for that matter, any tree on the face of the earth, and you'll never see the fruits coming out before the leaves. The leaves always come before the fruits. He suggests that perhaps the exception to that rule is the esrog tree, because the esrog tree is perio kodem la'olav, that the esrog comes out before the leaves on the tree. Tosfos completely rejects Rabbeinu Tam, and he says that's not true. Even in the esrog tree, the olim gedalim kodem aperi, that first you have the leaves. So what does Chazal have in mind? It's nice to knock down Rabbeinu Tam, but can you offer me a better solution? Kitapuach batzei ayar, Klal Yisrael is compared to tapuach because the olim come after the peri. Well, where is that? What does that mean? Says Tosfos, this is a really chiddush, a big insight of Tosfos. The Gemara tells us about the esrog tree, that it's dar be'ilon mishana l'shana. It's on the tree from one year to the next. What does that mean? After a year, the leaves on the esrog tree from last year fall and are replaced by new leaves. Annually, the esrog tree will regenerate its leaves. And what that means is that the esrog of last year came before the olim of this year. So you have an esrog that has esrogim on the tree. We enter into the new year, and now the olim from last year fall and are replaced by new olim. So that's called kodam hapri li olim. Last year's peros are still on the tree, and they came before the olim of this year's tree. And Tosfos offers a mashal to understand this. He says the following: the pri is nasa, the olim is nishma. How so? He says that the nasa refers to the asiyas ha-mitzvah. So the esrog itself, the peri, with which we makayim the mitzvah, that's called nasa. The olim are called Torah, limud Torah. That's nishma. And that equation is not apparent. Why are the olim symbolic of Torah and of nishma? And he says the following: that olim gidelim lifnei yitziras hapri, when normally the leaves grow before the pri, hem hachana ushmira al hapri, the leaves prepare the ground for the tree for the production of its fruit, and the leaves will protect the fruit. And he says that the fruit, as we saw before, represents nasa, but we need to prepare for nasa. But that's not enough. The preparation for nasa is the olim that grow before the peri. And that's going to be the Torah study that makes it possible for us to fulfill the mitzvahs, because ein amoritz chassid and gadol talmud maybe lidei ma'aser. So you need Talmud to get to ma'aser. But now in the next year, in the esrog tree, we have olim that come another round. That's after the peri has already grown. He says, ha'olim ha'gedelim achar yitzias hapri. Now the pri is already on the tree, and once the pri is on the tree, it doesn't need the protection. In other words, while the tree is producing the peros, which we said are the mitzvahs, at that point we need the preparation and the protection that's offered by the olim, which is the Torah. So that's the Torah that came before the pri. But now we're saying that Klal Yisrael are great. And what makes them great? Because there's olim after the pri. Right? The lashon of the Gemara is that tapuach is perio kodem le'olim. The pri is first, and then the olim comes second. Well, why And what's the purpose of the Olam coming second? The Torah that was meant to protect us and project us to the Asiya of the pre, those were the Olam that came before the Peri. That's the Torah that we studied before the mitzvahs. Why is there Olam, namely Torah study, after the pre is already fully ripened? There's no longer need for protection and for producing the fruit. It's already on the tree. The answer is that those Olim represent the Torah after the mitzvahs, the Torah which is Lishma, as an end unto itself. We're going to start an essay here on page 426. Again, thank you to David for sending it out. When Klal Yisrael come to Midbar Sinai to receive the Torah in Parshas Yisro, it says the following: B'chodesh hashlishi l'tzeis b'nei Yisrael miMitzrayim, Eretz Mitzrayim, bayom hazeh bo Midbar Sinai, vayisu mirfidim, vayavo Midbar Sinai, vayachnu b'midbar, vayichen sham Yisrael neged ha'am. First, he should have told us in the pasuk where they're located. Vayavo Midbar Sinai. And yet, in the sequence of the psukim, Vayavo Midbar Sinai is left for second. It opens up with B'chodesh hashlishi. So this is the question of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. And he offers the following answer. He says that the reason why the Torah opens up this parsha with B'chodesh hashlishi, let's say B'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim b'yom hazeh bo Midbar Sinai, is because this pasuk is an allusion to the creation of the world. From the 6 days of Bereshis, there was an anticipation of this day of Kabbalas HaTorah. Vayerev vayivoke Yom HaShishi, the hay of Yom HaShishi is telling us that Hisna Kadosh Baruch Hu Ma'aseh Bereshis Omer Lev Im Yisrael Mekabelas HaTorah Atem Miskaymen V'im Lav Ani Machzir Es HaOlam L'Tov Vavo. Rashi explains the Hey idea of Hayom HaShishi, of Yom HaShishi, is a remez to the Tanai that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said that the 5, right, Hey represents the 5 Chumashim, is a representative of Kabbalas HaTorah. And Hashem is saying that the creation of the world is conditional. Only if Bnei Yisrael will accept the Torah, then will the world be perpetually existing. So the Hay represents the 5 books of Moses, and Shishi represents the 6th of Sivan. So when it says, Vayerev vayivoker Yom HaShishi, it's referring to the Kabbalah of the Hay of the 5 Chumashim on the 6th day of Sivan, Yom HaShishi. So the entire universe, as it were, was anticipating Klal Yisrael accepting the Torah, which would justify the entire enterprise of creation. And he says the following. Why was there such hisragshus anticipating Kabbalas HaTorah? All this emphasis on Klal Yisrael coming into Midbar Sinai, standing Keneged Ahar, Bo Midbar Sinai, Klal Yisrael came to Midbar Sinai. A great simcha broke out in Shamayim and Oretz, because this is now the moment in which the creation reaches its tachlis, its ultimate purpose. What's called in philosophy teleology, the purpose of creation was Kabbalas HaTorah. And that's why there was so much emphasis here in the Torah on Klal Yisrael Bo Midbar Sinai. That is the beginning of the justification for all of the creation. Amar Rabbi Avo, this is a Medrash Shmos Rabbah. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shenosan HaKadosh Baruch Hu es HaTorah, Sipor lo tzavach, Of lo parach, Shor lo ga, Ofanim lo ofu, Srafim lo amru kadosh, Kadosh hayam lo nistazea, Habrios lo dibru, Kol ha'olam shosek u'machrish. The entire world came to a standstill. Complete silence. V'yotza kol, and the divine voice came out, Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Why is the entire world coming to a cessation? And the answer is because creation, in a sense, terminated on that day, and there was a new creation. Everything in the world was batel, was completely null and void, to be replaced by a new creation. And that new creation is Kabbalas HaTorah. So the day of Matan Torah is Chidush HaOlam. The Gemara in Masechet Avodah Zarah, Omer Chizkiya Ma'idetzi Mishamayim Hishmata Din Eretz Yireya Ushketa. Im Yireya Lama Shketa, Shketa Lama Yireya, El Betchila Yireya, Lebasot Shketa. Rashi says, Betchila Yireya, Shema lo Yekablu Yisrael Satorah, V'tachzor ha'oretz l'tov vavo, U'lebasov Kishikibluah, V'nasa v'nichma Shokta. The land was shocked, was silent, because now, at that moment, all those fears about the possibility that Klal Yisrael would not accept the Torah were all pushed aside. So the day of Kabbalas HaTorah at Har Sinai was a Chidush HaBriya of Shamayim v'Oretz. He says here on page 428, in the main paragraph, from Brias Olam till Matan Torah, the existence of the world was completely suspended, completely dependent on, leaning on Chesed. Higias man Matan Torah, v'nisrokna kupas HaChesed. No longer Chesed. Hashem says, this is the critical moment. I've kept this world going until this moment, b'Chesed, totally out of compassion. No more compassion. Now, ha'olam omed mileches. The world stops dead in its tracks, as we saw before in the Medrash. What we need now is a new creation, because the old creation ended, it terminated. That chesed panned out, it petered out. Ad shechal Bria Chadasha, a new creation of the world, Al Yidei Kabbalas HaTorah. And the Gemara tells us in Psachim, Rabbi Yishu ben Levi, Hani Esrim V'Shisha Hodu, right, in Hodu Hashem Kitov, 26 Hodus, Keneged Mi, Keneged Chaf Vav Doros, Shebara Kadosh Baruch Hu B'Olamo, V'lo Nosan Lem Torah, V'Zano Sam B'Chesed. So the 26 Hodus represent the 26 generations that were in existence based on Chesed until Kabbalas HaTorah.
Rav, would you call it? Sorry, would you call it a new bria, or would you call it, say, like a butterfly, a caterpillar turning into a butterfly? Not necessarily a new creation, because it was all part of the concept of the creation, but it allowed creation to take its next step, so to speak. Would you say that?
I guess you could say that, but again, if we understand from Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi that Chesed terminated, if it petered out, as
yeah, but Chesed didn't terminate. I mean, Chesed became a higher level of Chesed. Everything became on a new plane, a higher plane of existence, higher plane of connection to Hashem.
he says the following: Biyom shekiblu Yisrael HaTorah b'Sinai, on that day, Hischadsha Habria, Hischadsha Habria.
Right. So not necessarily. Chadsha would be something of a new, like I said, like maybe like a butterfly from a caterpillar. It was a metamorphosis. It was a elevated.
Okay. The language is Yom Habria B'Chidush HaOlam. B'Yom Matan Torah Nischadsha Olam. I don't know, I take this very literally. Nischadsha Olam means whatever kept up the world until then, like I said before, was no longer there. And that's the language that Ha'olam Omad Mileches. Mileches means it couldn't continue. Everything froze. Maybe you could say the life force that generates existence terminated. And there was only that amount of time, 26 generations of chesed, and now, you know, the bank account is empty. You know, you go to fill up with, imagine going to fill up with gas, you know, with petrol, and there's nothing left in the tank. So there's a brand new creation here of the Yom HaShishi, Shishi B'Sivan. And even in the creation itself, there's an allusion to the creation of Yom HaShishi, that sixth day, not the sixth day of creation, but that sixth day of creation could no longer exist after the chesed of Chafav Doros terminated. So we needed Yom HaShishi, another creation, the creation of the sixth day, in this case, the sixth day of Sivan. He says the following: This is on the top of page 429. Afal pisha Kodesh Baruch Hu yachol haya lachlif es kiyum ha'olam mikoach ha'chesed lekiyum mikoach HaTorah keheref ayin below sheyamod ha'olam mileches. There was no need for the Eibishter to bring the world to a halt, as we saw in the Medrash. He could have just made a transition from koach ha'chesed to koach HaTorah. Nevertheless, Bikesh HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God wanted to bring the world to a cessation. L'lamed la'olam, ki below Torah ein chiyus v'kiyum la'olam. That's what keeps the good. Again, there was one time in history where Chesed of Hashem would keep the world going. That's gone. The only way of keeping the world going and perpetuating existence now is through Torah. There's no other source for chiyus. And here we want to add on page 429 the insight of Meir Simcha Mitvinsk in the Ar Sameach, in the Meshech Chochmah. And he says something phenomenal. He says in all the psukim in the Torah that mention which month we're up to in the Hebrew calendar, lunar calendar, there's always a vav at the beginning of the pasuk. For example, u'bechodesh hasheni b'shiva v'yesrim v'yehi bechodesh harishon b'shana shenis. Again, you can see in the footnotes here all the different psukim that he quotes. And the only exception to the rule is our pasuk that we began with, b'chodesh hashlishi l'tzeis b'nei Yisrael. Where's the vav that always repeats itself at the beginning of u'bechodesh hasheni, u'bechodesh hashlishi? Vav is left out. Honestly, if you would ask me this question, I would be totally embarrassed. And I'd have a clue how to answer this. It takes a Meshech Chochmah to come up with a thesis. And he says the following, that the Vav always indicates a chibur. It means when the Torah wants to say what happened in the second month or in the third month, it'll open up with a vav to tell you that whatever we spoke about earlier in the first or second months, now we connect that and it projects us and continues into the next month. Ooh. So that's the chibur. The exception to that rule is Matan Torah. Griyusa shel havav hamachaber. He says there's a negative here in the vav hamachaber, and we're going to omit the vav hamachaber. Lelamed al haschala chadosha. Again, this chadshus olam, whichever way you want to call it, a caterpillar here and a metamorphosis here, whatever you want to call it, I don't care. But at the end of the day, we're seeing over and over again, there's a chadshus olam. So don't add the vav, because the vav would indicate a connection to what came before the vav. There is no connection to what came before the vav. In the light of what we saw until now, let's embellish the Meshech Chochmah. What came before was 26 doros of chesed. And that ended. It's all in anticipation whether or not we can create the world by accepting the Torah. You know, until now we've been discussing the day of Matan Torah as a day of a chuppah, of Nisuin. Now it's another, when we're adding a whole new dimension to understanding the day of Matan Torah. It's the day of his Chadshus Habriya. It's Kamei Ein Rosh Hashanah. And that's why the Torah, in a very oblique, a very profound way, left out the Vav. Because Me'ata was starting a whole new chapter in history, in existence, in Bria. In Matan Torah maschil perek chadash b'chayim shel bnei Yisrael v'ayvoyas ha'olam. All new, not connected to the past. Separated. Leave out the Vav. And here we get to Reb Chaim Volozhin. If Chas v'Sholom, says Reb Chaim, there would be one moment of time where there's no Talmud Torah going on in the world, there's nothing to keep up the world. We're no longer in the realm of Chesed. It's pure Torah. Here's ha'olam tolui b'Torah's emes. And I didn't see this here in Hegyonei Halacha, but I know for a fact that in Volozhin Yeshiva, there was 24/7 learning. There was never a moment of absolute bittul Torah. They had a rotation system through the night in order to guarantee that in case nowhere on the face of the earth is anyone learning Torah, we know that someone's learning Torah. And that would guarantee the Kiyum HaOlam. As the Pasuk says in Yirmiyahu HaNavi, Im lo brisi yom v'layla chukos shomayim v'aretz lo samti. We need the brisi yom v'layla, the study of Torah day and night. Without it, chukos shomayim v'aretz, forget it. Lo samti. The Af says, Reb Chaim, Gam ish echad miYisrael levado. If one Jew is learning Torah somewhere on the face of the globe, Rav Kocho, how great is his power? Shebiyado u'mamid u'makayim is kol olamos. V'abriya b'chlolo. Because of this one Jew who's studying Torah, he is keeping the world afloat. Because the chesed is no longer. Now we need the Torah. The Torah becomes the source of life, of chiyus, for the entire universe. Very heavy. And now we want to study an insight of Reb Shlomo Kluger on page 430. There's a machlokas between Rav Yosef Cairo and the Ramah. When is the earliest time in the month that we can be Mekadesh the Levon? Beis Yosef holds it's from the 7th day after the Molad. And he says this is based on the Chachmei Kabbalah. However, the Ramah, based on the Gedolei Achronim, says it's 3 days, me'es le'es, from the Molad. Meaning that according to the Ramah, once 3 days passed, and the moon is visible, we're already benefiting from the light of the moon. We don't have to wait a full week. And he even encourages us, Levarech ala levana vein lahachmitz hamitzvah. Don't delay. I would add my own comment here. Don't delay because you don't know what tomorrow's weather conditions are going to be like. So chaparine. Comes along Reb Shlomo Kluger. He says the following: even according to the Beis Yosef, who maintains that we have to wait a week until from the Molad until Kiddush Levana, Chodesh Sivan is the exception to the rule. I'm sorry. Even according to the Ramah, who says that we don't delay Kiddush HaChodesh, which means that on day 4 after the Molad I should already be Mekadesh the Chodesh, don't delay. Don't dilly-dally and postpone and procrastinate the mitzvah of Kiddush HaChodesh. Comes along Reb Shlomo Kluger and he says, but not in the month of Sivan. Month of Sivan, we're going to postpone Kiddush HaChodesh until after Chag HaShavuos. Until the earliest would be in Eretz Yisrael the 7th, or in Chutz La'aretz the 8th of Sivan. Batam. Roy lahamtin ad liachar matan Torah. Ad liachar shenasu ha'ma'oros shalonu b'koach HaTorah shekibalnu. Listen to this language. Again, it also touches again on your point, Joe, but listen what he says. Reb Shlomo Kluger says, we're going to wait for Kiddush Levana until after Shavuos. Why? Because Ad shenasu ha'ma'oros shalanu, our ma'oros, nasu mikoach HaTorah shekibalnu. And this is mind-boggling. We're talking about Kiddush HaBriah. The great luminaries, the sun and the moon and the stars, they cease to exist. Because the chesed petered out. So what are we left with? Torah. Now's the time to realize that the sun and the moon have been created. And it's a brand new sun and a brand new moon. Now it's time for Kiddush Levana. Again, listen to the language. He says, Roy lahamtin ad liachar matan Torah, ad liachar shenasu ha'ma'oros. What do you mean nasu ha'ma'oros? The ma'oros were created in the Sheishis Yemei HaMaaseh. Ad liachar shenasu ha'ma'oros shalonu mikoach HaTorah shekibalnu. The ma'oros of before Matan Torah not the same as the ma'oros after Matan Torah. Again, I don't know what the Kabbalistic meaning of all this is. I'm sure I'll pick Kabbalah. There must be deeper meanings. I don't have access to the Kabbalah. But it's not the same sun, and it's not the same moon, and the ma'oros are not the same with Matan Torah and onwards. A brand new element. And on that, we should be Mekadesh Levana.
Rav, is it possible that the chesed was the chesed of Hashem in keeping existence,
keeping it going,
keeping.
So God is penetrating, is generating a life force into existence, right. And that comes from chesed.
From Hashem's chesed, it's Hashem's chesed. The world should not have actually been in existence until Matan Torah. It was only the chesed of Hashem what was allowing existence to continue.
Perpetuate. The perpetuation of existence was a matter of chesed.
From chesed from Hashem.
From Hashem.
And now, once Torah was given, it's not just the chesed of Hashem.
Okay, so again, I'm just telling you, I could go over it again and again and again, but over and over again, we're talking about Chadshus HaBriah. I didn't create those words. They're in Chazal, they're in the Midrashim, they're in the Rishonim, the Achronim, it's Chadshus HaBriah. They're new Ma'oros, could you imagine? Post-Matan Torah, brand new Ma'oros. We are celebrating on Chag HaShavuos, not just Kabbalas HaTorah, but Brias HaOlam. The Olam that was created and generated and perpetrated by Chesed is no longer. It's a thing of the past. And now there's Kabbalas HaTorah. Says Reb Shlomo Kluger, now's the moment to go out and be Mekadesh Levana. He's almost like saying that if you're Mekadesh Levana before Chag HaShavuos, you're not Yotzei. Why? Because that Kiddush is on something that no longer exists. So we might as well wait till after Kabbalas HaTorah and then be Mekadesh the Levana, because now the Levana exists. And the title of this essay, Elyonim Sasu, etc., comes from a piyut. This piyut in the Ashkenazic rite is read on Shavuos at the end of Azharos. Now, I can't read the Azharos. I tried a few times. It's just impossible for me. And Rav Saadia Gaon wrote the Azharos trying to prove that all 613 mitzvos are subsumed under the 10 dibros. So he has a list in his Azharos of all the mitzvahs that are subsumed under Anochi Hashem Elokecha, Lo Yilach Alim Achirim, Lo Tisa Hashem Hashem L'Shav, etc., etc. At the end of that piyut, which is called the Azharos of Rav Saadia Gaon, we read a piyut that's called Ata Hinchalta Torah Lamecha. You have bequeathed Torah to your nation. And the Python says the following. Elyonim sasu, v'tachtonim olzu v'loshen aliza, aliz, v'Kabbalas HaTorah ksuva misinai. He opens up by saying Elyonim sasu, which we assume is a reference to the Malachi Asharis. They are the Elyonim. But how could you say about the Elyonim sasu when Chazal say that the Elyonim came to be Makatreg? Don't give the Torah to Klal Yisrael. Ma enosh ki tizkerenu. So how do you justify Elyonim sasu? Then it says Tachtonim olzu. The Tachtonim were dancing out of joy. I don't get it. Where do we find that Klal Yisrael were dancing out of joy because they got the Torah? It's Kof Aleim Har Kegigos. Hashem had to compel us to accept the Torah. So, one of the great poskim in the Ashkenazic rite is called the Mata Levi. And he writes the following. Elyonim Sasu refers to the Malach. Li'achar sheroa malachim ritzono shel makom litein Torah lebanav. Once the Malachim became aware of the fact that Hashem had a desire to teach the Torah, to give the Torah, to transmit the Torah to Klal Yisrael, al yidei sheyikablua b'shleimus, nasnu lo hodah v'gam sasu v'simchu. When they realized the capacity, the capability of Klal Yisrael to accept the Torah b'shleimus, and that's why Hashem desired to give the Torah to Klal Yisrael, sasu. The same malachim that were complaining bitterly now are won over, and they're dancing in the streets. Tachtonim olzu hakavana la'am Yisrael. Behechon matzinu bitui shel simcha lekabbalas HaTorah b'nei Klal Yisrael. Where is the simcha? Says the Orach Chaim HaKadosh in Bamidbar Chaf Aleph, Ki Yisrael sharu shira al Kabbalas HaTorah. Did you ever hear this? Yisrael sharu shira b'Kabbalas HaTorah. Again, you're scholars. I never heard of it. I know of the Shira al Hayam. V'shirasam, where do you have the chutzpah of saying such a thing? Where's there Shira on Kabbalas HaTorah? I didn't see it. Suva b'Parshas Chukas. It's in the 21st chapter of Bamidbar. Oz Yoshir Yisrael es hashira azos ali be'er anu Lashem. Anula. I always thought that was a shira at the Be'er Shel Miriam. Says the Arachaim, no, you're missing the point. Hashira Azu HaTorah Amra. It's the Torah that's singing this song. Ubazelo nikra tagar al adora hu lomalo sharu shira chadasha shenitlam Torah morasha shala novo tehila. Why weren't we saying Ale? Why were we singing shira? And he says, "Ki bevadai he zos shiras HaTorah shenikres be'er mayim." The be'er mayim is a symbol of Torah. Ein mayim el Torah. Let me read it again. The efshar ki shira zu al HaTorah amru. I left out that word al. I apologize. We sang a song on the Torah. And at what point do we sing this song? Well, we got to Be'er Shel Miriam. Now, I don't know how long it took from our Sinai until we got to Be'er Shel Miriam. Maybe it took 3 days. But they didn't sing on the Torah immediately. And you might say, well, that's a tagar against Klal Yisrael. At the Yam Suf, they sang immediately. And here on Kabbalas HaTorah, they didn't sing immediately. Says the Arachaim, Rak Oz Amdu Al Tiva Shehi Meshivas Nafesh. When the Pasuk says they went 3 days by Yilonu Yisrael, because they didn't have water to drink, they were thirsty. Chazal say that Ein Simon El Torah. Have you called Torah? Have you called Samim L'Chulamayim? Ein Mayim El Torah. They went 3 days without Torah, and they were famished. They were dehydrated. They were longing for the Mayim of Torah. And when they got to Be'er Shel Miriam, which symbolizes the Torah, at that point, they broke out in song. And he says that Oz Amdu Al Tiva Shel Torah Shehi Meshivas Nafesh. Pretty amazing, no? Another shira. And this concept of Shivas Nafesh, Chazal and Gemara Bava Kama say that we have to read the Torah within a 3-day period. We can't have a 3-day period going by without Kriyas HaTorah B'tzibur. So you have Shabbos, and then you have Monday, and then you have Thursday. So between Monday and Thursday, you have 3 days. We always stay within a 3-day radius, so to speak. And it's all based on this, that the Klal Yisrael were thirsty after 3 days of not having Torah. And the pasuk says nilu. The best translation I could give to that is fatigue. They were fatigued. I wouldn't say just physically, but spiritually they were fatigued. They were dry. There's something about reading the Torah publicly with the tzibur of Klal Yisrael that elevates the tzibur to a level of kedusha, satiation almost. So we can't go through 3 days without the reading of the Torah. And the opposite of Nilu is Meshivas Nofesh. When Klal Yisrael received the Be'er Shel Miriam, at least metaphorically, and they received the Torah, it means they became familiar with the Torah. Until that point, okay, they accepted the Torah, but there was no familiarity. And once they became familiar with the Torah and they realized, wow, this is Torah's emes, this is incredible, this is infinite wisdom, at that point they broke out in song, in joy. And they sang the Shira, which we think is on the Be'er Shel Miriam, but really in truth that Shira is on the Torah itself. So today, we're after the Churban Abayis. Chazal say, Ein lanu shir el HaTorah. So all we have left is the Torah. But that's not bad because the Torah is Meshivas Nafesh. Whatever we feel dry, thirsty, empty, lacking Torah, we don't have the water of Torah. So then we read the Torah and it's Meshiv Nefesh. It gives us new vitality. I'm almost tempted to think this is also part of the same philosophy of his Chadshus HaOlam. That just like the Bria needs after Chesed panned out, petered out, we needed a new Bria through Kabbalas HaTorah. We ourselves need Meshivas Nefesh. Our Nefesh is dry without the Torah. I would like to dedicate next week's shir to finish up on this concept of Kabbalas HaTorah and read an essay here in Hegyonei Halacha called Amela Shel Torah. So David, if you're available now to write down the pages, because sometimes, I forget or whatever it is, you don't. So it's pages 432, if you can write this down, to 441. I'll go over that one more time. 432 to 441. Okay. And it's a wonderful essay called Amela Shel Torah. And I feel that this essay has to project us throughout the year so that the year will be a year of Amela Shel Torah. Heim Amelim, V'onu Amelim. Heim Amelim v'lo makablim schar. Onu Amelim u'makablim schar. And if you could have in mind for Refuah Shlema, Dvorah Chana Bas Ratza, I've mentioned her name many times, but situation is a little bit tricky now. I'm saying it b'lashon hamata, so please keep that in mind. There's another essay here called Birchas HaTorah. And I think if we could fit that in before the Dry Vachin, because during the Dry Vachin, I want to speak to you about Churban Abayis, about the concept of Avelus, comparing Avelus Chadosha to Avelus Yishon. I think we've spoken about it in the past, but Ein Beis Medrash below Chidush. So a very, very quick summary and synopsis of what we studied today. We have some really radical conclusions to derive from the fact that Kabbalas HaTorah is a chasana, Yom Chasunoso is a Matan Torah, and many minhagim that reflect the fact that we're going into a status as a chasam v'kala with Shivas Yimei HaMishteh. We spoke about Nasiv and Nishma from the Beis HaLevi's perspective, whereas Nishma now becomes an end unto itself. And finally, the fact that we are Makabel Torah yearly, annually, and we are compared to the Tapuach, meaning to the esrog tree, in Rabbeinu Tam's frame of reference, where there are olim that protect the fruit before the fruit appears on the tree, and then olim after the fruit appears. And that olim after the fruit appears represents metaphorically Torah Lishma, Torah for the sake of Torah. And finally, we discussed this idea of Chidush HaOlam. There's no Vav in the Pasuk, Machodesh HaShlishi. Bo Midbar Sinai, no Vav, no connection to the past. It's a brand new Chidush HaOlam. And whatever gave us the perpetual existence for the 26 generations before the Torah, that's Chesed, that's gone. Now we need Kabbalas HaTorah. And Kabbalas HaTorah is going to keep the world afloat and perpetuate its existence, but there's got to be, says Reb Chaim Volozhin, a constant 24/7. There's not a single moment which is bereft of Torah study. Only that can guarantee the existence of the world. Because now the world exists not on Chesed, but on Torah. And we begin to appreciate that perhaps Klal Yisrael recited a Shira, maybe a little bit after they felt dry without the Torah, spiritually, psychologically. And that's a Shira on the Hischadjus of man after Kabbalas HaTorah. The great Simcha that we were Zocher to Torah. The Malachim was Sameach because they realized that this is what Hashem wanted, and the people came with a robust commitment of Nasa v'Nishma. But down here on earth, we're also happy, and we'll designate Shavuos as a day of celebration, of joy, because Matan Torah is the greatest joy that we can have. The greatest Simcha and Aliza is Matan Torah. This is the Be'er Shel Miriam, the Mayim of Torah that keeps us going. Without the Mayim, we are spiritually dehydrated. Leus. And what we need instead of Leus is Meshivas Nefesh. And that's why David HaMelech always compares the Torah to Meshiv Nefesh. Our entire Nefesh is imbued with life and vitality as a result of Torah. Yiratzon, may it be His will, that we dedicate ourselves to the love of Torah with a new Kabbalah. B'chol yom v'yom yu beinecha kechadashim. And with that love of Torah, there's no doubt that we'll have the Mayim, the Meshivas Nefesh that we need so desperately to give us that vitality, that power to perpetuate our own existence and the existence of the world. Kein Yiratzon. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. All right.